All right, welcome back to College Football Addiction, part 2 here with Graham Coffee. We'll talk a little bit about this Tennessee matchup. Graham, what's the mood after the Ole Miss game? Certainly a game that maybe didn't go down, didn't go down the way that UGA or UGA fans would have wanted. What is is there a hangover there? Is there, what's the bounce back? What are the thoughts coming into this one, playing at home this weekend against Tennessee?
Yeah, I don't think there's a hangover within the team necessarily, but I think there's a little bit of a hangover in the fan base for sure. I think people are upset. The reality is that Georgia football under Kirby Smart is, they're used to beating people up the way that they kind of got beat up last week. They're used to closing games out with a bunch of, sacks and strips and, once you get one-dimensional, you're dead kind of stuff with some of the edge rushers that they've had come through. So, seeing UGA struggle like that against Ole Miss and not just get beat by 18, but I think the way they got beat and the way that game ended, where it was like they literally could not block this dude off the edge. I think it was a little bit jarring for Georgia fans. And, there's some that I think are overreacting a little bit on social media and being like, well, this season's a wash, fire everybody, let's move on. And then I think there are some that said, hey, this was a really bad performance. It also comes at the end of this long stretch, 35 days away from home. You've played at Alabama, at Texas, at Ole Miss, Georgia dealing with a lot of injuries on the offensive line. Some of this kind of made sense, and, probably some problems came home to roost that have been building for a little while. Can you come home against a good Tennessee team, bounce back, and pretty much save your season, right? I think that's the task, and how well Georgia sort of spins this forward and doesn't let Ole Miss beat them twice, so to speak, will probably determine how we look back on this season in the long run.
Yeah, if you're UGA, you got to like coming home, a place that they've played really, really well and a place that they've played well against Tennessee. But Tennessee with a really good defense this year and a front that has done really, really well. UGA's had their struggles offensively for sure too, and that starts at the top with Beck and establishing a running game and really everything in between. You mentioned the offensive line. Like, how do you so a million questions at once. Thoughts on just health? You mentioned some injuries there along the front for UGA, and then matching up against a really good Tennessee defense.
Yeah, as you and I record this, we're I think about 2.5 hours away from both teams releasing their Wednesday kind of mandated SEC injury reports. I expect some names to pop up on there that I don't know that they'll surprise people necessarily, but Georgia, I think on the offensive line is very banged up, and I think there's some guys that are. I know there's some guys that are dealing with injuries that aren't really injury report worthy, because I don't think it'll hold them out of playing, but it is definitely affecting their performance. And dealing with James Pierce and some of these guys that Tennessee has up front, it's a bad time to have injuries in that position room. And then I think you've got Colby Young still wrapped up in the legal kind of spider web that he is in, so. His accuser recanted her original statement, but the DA hasn't dropped the charges, and until the DA does something and that goes away, Georgia's not going to bring him back. You've got Anthony Evans at wide receiver, who is dealing with a hamstring injury that happened, I think, the week of the Florida game in practice. So you are very, very limited on the offensive line. I think this wide receiver core, let's be honest, has not been overly talented all year. They lead the FBS in drops, and you're down a couple guys that can be difference makers in that room. At running back, you've got Trevor Etienne still dealing with a rib injury, was only able to take, I think, 7 carries, and 5 of those came on the first drive against Ole Miss. So behind him, you've got nothing but Nate Frazier, who is a true freshman, and then more true freshmen because Roderick Robinson and Branson Robinson are both still out. Georgia is very, very beat up on offense, and I think the unfortunate thing is that's kind of the the side of the ball where they can least afford to sustain injuries. They've been a bit sporadic on offense this year, have sort of struggled to have that week-to-week consistency, and I don't think that issue is being helped by different guys in and out of the lineup constantly.
What if you could make risk-free profits in sports betting? Now, this may sound too good to be true, but let me explain. The sports betting market in the US is so fragmented, with each sportsbook setting their own odds. This means that there are many opportunities to profit when two books get out of sync. You can bet on both sides. You can bet over on one book and under on another and lock in a risk-free profit. This strategy is called arbitrage, and it's the core of OddsJam. OddsJam scans hundreds of sports books in real time to find these bets, helping thousands of bettors earn tens of thousands of dollars every single month. Look at the results yourself. And here's the best part. You can try it for free. OddsJam offers a 7-day risk-free trial, giving you access to all of its data-driven tools, including the arbitrage and positive EV finder. If you don't love it, cancel with one click, no strings attached. Are you ready to bet smarter? Use promo code CFA for College Football Addiction to get 35% off your first month after the trial. Don't miss out on making smarter, risk-free bets with OddsJam today. What about on the other side? All the million questions around Nico are pretty big, though I feel like I'd be pretty surprised, if he didn't play. It feels like if he doesn't play, it's just the biggest, week of gamesmanship of all time.
Yeah.
You've gotten several people come out and say, like, I expect Nico to play. Heupel actually came out and said that he feels like he's trending toward being able to play and expects him to be able to give it a go. Obviously, they're a much different team if he wasn't able to go. But thoughts on how UGA's defense matches up with that side of the ball, a Tennessee team that's been somewhat sporadic with scoring the ball at times too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think with Nico, that whole thing has gotten bizarre, quite frankly. I mean, like you've got the Bear from Fox Sports saying he's not going to play. You got the dude that owns On3 saying he is going to play. Like you got it's like, what is going on? I don't know. I haven't heard a peep out of a beat reporter or anybody that kind of usually would break this type of news. So it is odd. Don't know what to make of that. And then for Georgia's defense, I think the Ole Miss game, they struggled at times, right? They were very good in the red zone, but they kind of got picked on underneath a lot. You go back and look. Honestly, their corners and safeties played very, very well in that football game. Their corners barely gave up any yardage. Their safeties barely gave up any yardage. Kiffin had some very specific plans to take advantage of a couple guys that play outside linebacker with running backs coming out of the backfield, and then some guys that kind of play that slot that Georgia calls it the star position, but it's kind of their hybrid safety linebacker spot. You take that yardage away and 3 passes that went for about 70 yards on Jalen Walker when he was in an inside linebacker. And, Georgia is pretty much even with those guys. Now, you can't do that. I mean, if everything to death, then anything can happen, obviously. But my point in saying all that is I think Georgia's secondary is probably in one of its better places that it's been all year and has looked a little more consistent the last couple weeks. I just don't know. Can Heupel match sort of what Kiffin showed in terms of getting those linebackers and slot corners matched up in man? If he can, then I think Tennessee can replicate Ole Miss's game plan pretty well.
What about slowing down Samson in that running game as well up front? How do you think Georgia fares this weekend?
I mean, look, Georgia's been a really good run defense for most of the year. You go and look at that Ole Miss game. Ole Miss popped a couple kind of 10-yard-ish type runs as the game went on, and Georgia had been out there a while. But, I mean, on the whole, Georgia in that, they were stuffing a lot of runs. I think 46% of Ole Miss's runs went for 2 yards or less. I think Georgia had 7 tackles for loss in the run game. So I think you feel good about where Georgia's run defense is. It's been a good run defense all year. You trust their defensive tackles. Their edges have been, known to be a little bit shaky at times, but also, I think, have gotten more consistent and kind of grown and been better since Michael Williams got back into the lineup. So I think you feel like if you're Georgia, you know, we can match up and like we can probably do as good a job on Samson as anybody else has. I'll say it this way, like it's very rare that anyone beats Georgia being one-dimensional. You could kind of argue that Ole Miss just did it last week, but the only teams I've ever seen beat Georgia being one-dimensional have been through the air, right? But, you know, we don't know, I think, what to expect necessarily from Tennessee, especially with this quarterback kind of, I don't know what going on with Nico and all that. But I think if you're UGA, you feel like we can do a good enough job on Samson to where these guys aren't just going to lean on us and run the ball down our throats down the field. Like we will give up 6-yard gains here and there, but if they run the ball 3 times, we're going to stuff one of those probably. I think that is the mentality. And I also think if you look at just Georgia's defense, you know, maybe if you're Tennessee, you have some drives where you can lean on Samson pretty well to like get you down inside the 40, inside the 30. But when the field shrinks, especially, Georgia's defense is really, really hard to run on because those corners and those safeties, they do a good job filling run lanes, and all of a sudden they're a lot closer to the football than they would be.
I struggle with the buy-in on how much losing the week before matters. Like I've probably seen 46 videos on like the Miami losing to Georgia Tech's like the best thing that could have happened to them, and I'm like, I don't know that I buy this kind of narrative or thought. Like so. I do think there are times a loss re-energizes teams, but when you just lose because you struggle to do things, like you just, when somebody exploits your weaknesses, they exploit your weaknesses, you know, and if the next team can do that same thing, then they're going to beat you too, right? I don't expect it, but if Wake Forest can play the same game Georgia Tech did, then they're going to beat them too. You know, like that's just how, you know, and same thing. If Tennessee can play the same game Ole Miss did, like losing last week doesn't matter, right? Like it just, but as much as I don't necessarily buy into that logic, Georgia has been really good coming off of losses. So maybe Kirby's an exception to that. So thoughts on, you know, the chance of a bounce back game, a play a little bit better than you last week, Tennessee not be able to replicate it. And then do you have a prediction in this one yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're Georgia, you look at this and Georgia's staff, especially on defense, is so good normally that they rarely get exposed, right? But the times where you have seen them exposed over the years, you normally kind of see them immediately fix that thing because they either have a schematic answer for it or they just have another, 5-star dude that they can plug in for the guy that maybe was struggling the week before, and they can kind of switch that out, and all of a sudden that matchup's just not on the field anymore. You look at Heupel and kind of what he does in games where Tennessee's offense works really well, especially through the air. He is a straight find the duck kind of play caller. Like, if he finds a matchup that works, not afraid to go at it over and over. He does not have any sort of ego around, like, balance or any of that kind of stuff. It's like, I'll throw 5 touchdowns to Jalen Hyatt if it'll help me beat Alabama, right? I think for Georgia, they can solve schematically some of these things that happen against Ole Miss, and just quite frankly, Tennessee's receiving core, especially with their inside receivers, doesn't have what Ole Miss had. So I think you feel pretty good about that. But yeah, Georgia coming off a loss has been tremendous. I mean, I was there at press availability yesterday. Kirby Smart seemed a lot happier and calmer and, kind of in the groove than he did, maybe at other times that I've seen him this year. Does that mean anything? Not necessarily. He might have just liked how his team practiced that day. But we talked to Lawson Lucky yesterday, and he was just like, we know we need to win this game. And said that in a way that you rarely hear anybody at Georgia say anything because they're so, like, process-oriented and just we're trying to take, good snaps in practice tomorrow, and we're just trying to get the next rep right. So I do think there's a sense of urgency of sorts. It sounds like there's been some pretty kind of, vocal moments from some of the leaders on that team. And I expect them coming home to be energized by the fan base and just not having to deal with what you have to deal with on the road. But at the end of the day, like, maybe that stuff provides a little energy in the early going, but it doesn't win football games. Like, players win football games, and good football plays win football games. So we'll see how it plays out. It's honestly very hard for me to get a read on this game with the quarterback kind of confusion and honestly just sort of the inconsistencies of Georgia this year. Like, offensively, I don't know what they're going to do. Against Ole Miss, they got so conservative that it was like they were almost totally non-explosive in that game. And okay, has the pendulum swung too far to where you're trying to protect Carson Beck from making a turnover, but by doing that, you're sort of like neutering him and taking away what he does well and like not letting him use that arm talent. So I don't know. I really don't know, TJ. Like, are they going to come out? I think if Georgia's smart, they'll let him throw the football downfield, because that's the only way you're going to create the space that you need probably to run on this Tennessee defense. And I think Georgia, like, they don't want to get into another game where they're playing in a phone booth like they were last week, especially with your offensive line beat up. So if I'm a Georgia fan, I'm hoping that Mike Bobo is going to kind of, let my quarterback off the reins. And if he throws a pick somewhere along the way, he throws a pick somewhere along the way. But they've won a lot of games this year where they've turned the ball over, because when they're not turning the ball over, they're usually hitting big plays. And I think that's what Georgia needs to get back to if they want to, not lose this game as a whatever 8.5-point favorite they are.
Graham, where can people follow you? Where can they find your work, bud?
You can find me on Twitter at Graham Coffee DC, and anything dogcentral.com, Dog Central Podcast, Dog Central YouTube channel. You'll find me if you type Dog Central into your browser. So hope to see you.
Thanks, buddy. I appreciate you for hanging out, man.
Thank you.